You're listening to BC Polytalk. I'm Daniel Fontaine, the co-host.
And I'm Bill Tillman.
On today's show, we have David Hutniak from Landlord BC. As you can well imagine, during this current COVID pandemic, landlords across British Columbia are extremely stressed in terms of whether or not they're going to be able to receive any rent payments from. We know right now many businesses and individuals are being impacted by the numbers of people being unemployed and businesses that are shuttered. Bill, I can only imagine when we talk to David today that he will be expressing a lot of concern on behalf of his members and what's happening to them across British Columbia.
No doubt. And as we know, we heard news of 1 million Canadians applying for EI-LOT the past week, and millions more Americans. So everyone who's unemployed has to be looking at their rent check as an enormous Mount Everest to climb. And they do know that the federal government is going to be bringing in enhanced EI or emergency funding of up to 75% of their income. So that will help, but nobody has a check in their hand yet. And I'm sure that for a lot of renters, they'll be sitting there saying, well, I can pay my landlord, I can pay my childcare, I can buy food. The rent is going to be a problem. And I think we're already seeing some of that, but we'll definitely ask David about that.
Yeah, we've already gone past April 1st, which was the first time period when rent was due for many British Columbians. And that would have been a time when a lot of landlords would have been able to have that discussion with their tenants as to whether or not they're able to cover the rent. And as you said, you make a good point. A lot of the money has not, in fact, I don't think any of the money has flowed out yet. So many British Columbians are right now relying on their savings. And we all know, I think we've talked about it on this show before, that I think Canadians have less than a paycheck away from needing to borrow money from a friend to make rent and buy food and that kind of stuff. So it's going to be pretty dire for many renters as well as for the landlords who rely on that rent to pay their mortgage. And that's what sometimes people forget, that so many people have basement suites in their homes and they're relying on that income in order to pay their mortgage. So there's a double impact for sure.
Yeah, and Landlord BC does represent a lot of the small landlords, the small owners who might have one suite or two suites in a building. And for sure, that's one of them. For others, there are obviously people whose entire income comes from having rental buildings, rental apartment buildings and others. And so it's a big deal for them as well. And, you know, Daniel, this is one of those times I'll ask David his view, but we've always had from the right side of the fence the old joke, I'm from government, I'm here to help. And it always draws a laugh whenever I use that. But right now, it's true.
Yeah, no, right now it's as true as it's ever been in our history. And, the other thing I'll throw in and raise with him is landlords have a really negative reputation. I mean, you look out in the community, people say that landlords don't treat their tenants well, et cetera. And I don't think that's necessarily the case in the vast majority of times. But how will an organization like Landlord BC and landlords be able to get any kind of sympathy or any kind of reaction from government when there is that negative reputation out there? And yet you and I both know that there are, as you indicated, a lot of small family mom and pop and also basement suite type landlords who need that income in order to make sure that they can put food on their table as well. So I'll be interested to hear from him how they're dealing with that and how well they're working with government as they go through the various different programs they're trying to implement.
Yeah, and I also want to ask him, not completely to do with COVID, but we've seen some reports recently that Seattle has been much more successful, maybe 10 times or more successful than Vancouver has in terms, or King County, Metro Vancouver, in terms of building rental housing. And so I want to ask him about that, why they have much more success than we've had here, and are there things we can learn from them?
Yeah, and while I know that COVID will dominate our conversation, no doubt today, I also am going to throw in the insurance rates. You and I have talked about how the insurance premiums that were skyrocketing before the pandemic hit. I don't think that situation has gotten any better. So I'd like to probe a little bit more with David on that. So we'll be right back with David Hutniak, the CEO of Landlord BC.
BC Polytalk thanks Harbour Air for supporting the show. It's through sponsorship and viewer support that we get to produce this show.
David Hutniak from Landlord BC, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It must be extremely difficult right now dealing with the enormous pressure of both tenants in the buildings that your members represent and the members themselves everybody facing a financial crisis, all sorts of people unemployed, the restaurant industry, hospitality, tourism industry all devastated. I'm sure a lot of those folks and others who are affected by this, hairstylists, you name it, are tenants in buildings that your members own.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge challenge. What further makes it more challenging is that, our sector is disproportionately represented by small mom and pop landlords, people with basement suites, et cetera. They represent easily 2/3 or more of the entire rental universe in terms of number of units. And, most or many of those folks, with a basement suite, they have regular jobs, and so they're impacted by this as well. And so they have a mortgage that they need to pay, and they're really relying on that rental income to help them keep their own housing. And the notion of approaching banks for deferral of mortgage payments is more challenging than, say, if you were just a regular mortgage holder, because the bank considers that rental income as an important basis for the deferral. And if there's no rent coming in, hugely challenging. So we're concerned for the entire sector, but I have to admit, that those small mom and pops are the group that we're most concerned about.
Right. And just for our listeners and viewers, could you just give us a thumbnail sketch of what your organization does and who its members are?
Yeah, sure. So we're an industry association. We're a nonprofit society, and we represent owners and managers of rental housing and private sector rental housing providers. We have 3,300 members. They're from the biggest owners and property managers in the province to, like I said, all of the mom and pops. In terms of sort of the rental universe, this will be helpful. There's about 550,000 households that rent their homes, 30% of the British Columbia population. And needless to say, the homes we provide are really critical.
So, David, it's Daniel here. Just, when we look at what you've just said, I was just looking last night online just to see kind of some of the things you were indicating to the media. And I just checked on a Times columnist story where you said, quote, "This is a huge, huge mess for everybody." You went on to say this is about a whole sector that is just imploding. There was quote after quote. So in normal times, landlords typically get the rap that they're not particularly that sympathetic when someone can't pay their rent. And so I know we're in a pandemic now, but is this perhaps maybe just inflammatory language from an industry association that now wants help when perhaps it wasn't helping others? Because that's what's out there on social media, people saying landlords shouldn't be getting a break because they don't give us a break when we can't pay our rent. How do you respond to those comments?
Yeah, I mean, let's be honest here. Our sector is not the recipient of a whole bunch of empathy on at the best of times, and our organization, myself in particular, CEO, we've never been nuanced about the fact that there are players in our sector who do not appreciate what best practices is and their responsibilities. The vast majority of landlords are good, responsible landlords, just like the vast majority of tenants are good, responsible tenants. It's a highly emotional relationship, obviously, because it involves housing. But the reality is, again, because we're so disproportionately represented by small mom and pops, this is going to be hugely challenging. And while the province has taken some measures, the rent supplement, is going to be good for renters, and they've made it abundantly clear that they expect renters to continue to try to pay their rent. At the end of the day, this is a sector that's heavily dependent upon cash flow, and so everybody needs to chip in here. And I think we have a crisis here. Demonizing landlords is not really productive, and certainly in terms of the messaging that we give to our sector and have for the past 3+ weeks is, talk to your tenants, work with them, find accommodation, be compassionate, I mean, this is not the time for sort of everyone taking a hard stance, polarizing and pitting landlords against tenants.
Yeah. David, I wanted to ask you something. You also are obviously an advocate for the creation of more rental housing in British Columbia and Metro Vancouver. And you were quoted not too long ago talking about how Seattle, I think if I get the numbers right, please correct me otherwise, Seattle had created something like 17,000 rental houses in, I think, 2018, and Vancouver was somewhere around 1,400 by comparison. What, pardon me, what do you see as the differences that would allow Seattle to create so much more rental housing?
Well, there's a combination of factors. The number I think is that's for the King County. I think Seattle has been producing about 14,000 units of purpose-built rental housing. So these are apartment buildings, and that's in each of the last since 2015. And I'm not sure what's going to happen in 2020. Part of it is that their legislative structure is quite different here. They don't have rent control, for example, which has encourages more supply, and also condos aren't as prevalent there. So purpose-built rental as a housing typology certainly gets more traction. But they also have implemented pretty robust policies, tax holidays, property tax holidays, pardon me, to really incent developers to build rental. And, so they've had huge success with that.
And what kind of suggestions would you give to, say, Vancouver Mayor Kennedy Stewart or the mayors of the other adjoining municipalities here in Metro Vancouver that they could do to make some positive changes? I don't think rent control is likely to come off the table, and that's a big item for sure. But are there other things that we should be doing here to improve the rental stock?
Well, I mean, I don't know that this is the time to really even get into that, Bill, to be honest with you. I mean, right now we're trying to deal with a crisis here. But I will say this, that if we don't, right now, the way things are structured, we have a moratorium on evictions. Currently, neither the federal nor provincial government is really sort of backstopping our sector in terms of unpaid rent deferrals, etc. So those conversations are continuing. So I think in the context of this crisis and the broader implications, it's the viability of our sector is critical, so that we have the supply we have continues, because we're at near zero vacancy rates as it is. And then certainly the part of that whole viability conversation is ensuring that there's a business case to continue to build more. And so that's has to be included in the conversation. But really, right now, we're just trying to ensure that people are housed, because we have a health crisis here, and that renters and landlords are working together cooperatively. But ultimately, we're going to need to have the provincial and federal government really work together here, because we see a situation where 3-4 months from now, there could be huge rent deficiencies, rent debts, basically, that renters will have for deferred or unpaid rent. And we may have a legal right to try and collect that, but I think it's going to be challenging. And so we're going to need to work together with government to really find solutions, because it simply can't be put on the backs of one sector. This has to be a broader taxpayer funded solution.
So, David, just looking a bit bigger and going back specifically to the COVID pandemic and how it's impacting your sector, we looked at a couple things. One is the federal government has been working with the banks, who have indicated that they're willing to kind of defer mortgages. Now, the jury's out as to whether or not that's working. We're hearing reports of, I think there was over 500,000 Canadians have asked for the deferment of their mortgage payments. But first of all, do you think the federal government and the provincial governments in general have done enough to force the banks and to encourage them to look at this deferment, to assist perhaps some of your members who have tenants who may not be paying their rent, but they still have their mortgage payments that they have to pay? That's the first question. And the second one is around this $500 payment. Could you comment on that? And I'm assuming you'd be happy that the payments are at least coming to you. I'm assuming the landlords would be happy that the payment is coming to them. But that $500 payment, is it enough? Is it going to perhaps change the system more permanently? Are we ever going to be able to go back from not giving away the $500 again? Maybe comment on those if you could.
Sure. Well, I touched on the mortgage deferral a little earlier, but certainly I would say, without being overly critical, I think the federal government and the provincial government really need to go more aggressively after the banks. And again, it's the small landlord with a basement suite with a regular job is not getting mortgage deferral. Okay. And first, the other thing, this is not free anyway. This comes with significant costs in terms of fees, interest upon interest. It's all repayable. So that's not really a solution. It's at best an interim measure, and it has other consequences. The $500 rent subsidy, well, absolutely. I mean, we were advocating, and obviously Landlord BC was very involved in communicating with the province throughout this process, and in advance of what they announced on March 25th. I mean, we were advocating very strongly for robust renter supports. And we were actually proposing the rent bank concept be employed, which is for the full amount of rent for people who qualified. Those are interest-free microloans, basically, and or some hybrid version, which could have included some grant for maybe $500 and then a rent bank. And the province decided to go this route, and that's their prerogative. So it was $500 for 3 months, and I believe it's per household. I'm sorry, I don't even know for certain today. As of today. But nevertheless, absolutely, it's going to help renters in the sense that, it's going to demonstrate to them that the province is there to support them. It's also going to demonstrate to renters that they have a responsibility to pay their rent. So it's, I think it's good messaging and good support. The fact that it does, go to the landlord, that's an administrative sort of logistical process they elected to do. And we were involved in those conversations and said, yeah, that makes sense, So yeah, I think it's an important step. There's, in an area like Vancouver, and there's sunshine, is highly very expensive rents, and so there's a huge gap that still will need to be filled.
David, there was obviously from some quarters complaints when the government's program was announced that the money should go directly to tenants. Could you explain what the thinking was on that? Because I would envision that there could be a gap between it going to rent and it going to possibly other expenses. So for the landlord, obviously that would be a big problem. But what was the thinking behind that?
Well, I can't speak for the government, but on the basis of sort of some of the discussions we did have, I think they were just wanting to. First of all, the landlord has to also, as part of the application process, the tenant makes the initial application. It's tied to whether or not they have qualified for EI or are in receipt of EI, and then the landlord needs to provide some verification. So I think they were just looking for sort of they want to do this as quickly as possible. They want to make it as streamlined as possible, but they also want some checks and balances. There's a significant amount of money, taxpayer money involved here. So they wanted to have some integrity in the process, and I don't think we could fault them for that. And I think they also wanted to make sure this was, they were the first province that did this, and I think there's only one other province that has. And so, like I said, a fairly significant investment. They wanted to ensure that it was definitely applied for this specific purpose. There's other programs that they have, the federal programs, et cetera, that can address the other, living costs. So I think that was the thinking behind it. And to me, that's sound.
So, David, I'm looking here at a report that that Goodman released, which indicated Goodman Commercial, which indicated that upwards of 50% of the folks that they surveyed were indicating to landlords that their tenants were not paying their rent already, just so early into this COVID-19. And there is definitely a prospect there. Some economists are saying that within the next couple of months, our unemployment rate could jump up to 10 12% in the province of British Columbia. Does that give you any concern going into the long term that already 50% of people aren't paying their rent? And then furthermore, that with unemployment being 10 to 12%, this may be going on for a very long time.
Yeah, I didn't see that number. Although one of my staff did highlight an aspect of it. I think it was a small number of landlords that they talked to. So, I can't verify whether that's correct or not. But we've talked to some of our members as well at this juncture, and it's it's really hard to tell at this point in time. I think that's the best answer. I think it's going to actually boil down to building by building, landlord by landlord, but we're seeing some variance, absolutely, where some are seeing a higher proportion of renters paying their April 1st rent, and some not so much. But I think April, we predicted from the outset that April, is going to have challenges for our sector, but it's probably going to be May and June that are really the months that are going to be more telling. And to your point about the unemployment rate, et cetera, so there's increased nervousness or greater nervousness around May and June. And in particular, I think this is going to go on for a period of time. The positive is that by then people will have some cash in their pockets from the federal and provincial programs. And so we're hoping that that's going to mitigate some of that. But yeah, there's huge uncertainty, and we're a long way from really knowing the full impacts. But I think it's pretty safe to say the impacts are going to be quite negative for everybody.
I'm wondering, just to follow up on Daniel's question, two things. One, could it be that a lot of people not having been in receipt of any federal money are saying, I know I can get away with not paying 1 month's rent, and so I want to see the federal cash in my hand, and also the BC subsidy for renters in my hand before I pay anything. The second part of that is Landlord BC approaching the government to say, hey, it's pretty obvious we need an extension on this program for the rent subsidy?
Yeah, there's lots of conversations going on. I mean, it's whether it needs to be extended, whether it needs to be more robust. I think the answer to both those questions is yes. They kind of modeled this on the basis of 3 months, I guess. So we'll have to see. There's, like I said, there's lots of conversations that need to happen, and at the same time, they're really hunkered down there. They've got a lot on their plate. They're scrambling. They're trying to do the best they can under really trying circumstances. So nothing is perfect, but definitely there's some issues here that we need to continue to address with them. We would hope to do that successfully before May 1st, but we'll have to see. And then, like I said, we're also thinking beyond May 1st. We're thinking of, okay, when this all ends, whether it's 3, 4, or 5 months from now, that how is our sector going to, what is it going to look like, and how do we move forward? And again, as I've mentioned on more than one occasion here, is like, it would not be fair or equitable to expect our sector to, have this put entirely on our backs. That just would not be fair. So, and it would be hugely detrimental. I mean, it would, we're part of a housing system. Let's understand this. And again, going back to the number of small landlords, and this is not just unique to British Columbia, it's across Canada. And these are all mortgage holders on single family homes. Some of them may be investment condos, what have you. But nevertheless, this is there's a lot of leverage involved in this, and there's a lot of vulnerable people. And so you could see, the entire housing universe really suffer hugely in terms of a worst case scenarios, a major collapse. That helps no one. That's going to have huge economic issues, and again, we're all in this together. And if the housing system collapses, it's not going to be good for mortgage holders or renters.
David, I happen to be one of those folks who owns an investment property. We do rent it out, just full disclosure for those who are listening and watching. So I come at this from a very personal perspective as well, but maybe switching gears a little bit off of the COVID and to the other crisis we were dealing with and that Bill and I were talking about before the pandemic hit, and that was around insurance rates and the fact that, for example, at our property, our insurance rates were going through the roof, and all these additional costs that were being passed on to essentially the folks who own the condominium. And then with rent controls in place, there's no ability for obviously for the landlord to pass any of those costs along. That situation, I'm assuming, has not gotten any better in the last few weeks. We're just not hearing about it. Is there any update that you can provide to our viewers, listeners, in terms of what's happening with insurance rates in BC and beyond?
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that question because it's a great question. It actually very much fits into the whole COVID-19 issue as well. Because here's the other thing, if you're operating a rental property, whether a building or a single unit like you have, your costs have not stopped. You've got all the costs associated with keeping that unit or that building operating, and a big one is definitely insurance. So nothing has improved on that front. Nothing has improved, and I don't see anything improving. That is a whole other issue, and who knows? It may even become worse because of this. That's a real possibility.
That's what I was
a real
going to
possibility. And I'm no insurance expert, but I know enough about how we got to where we are in terms of these huge increases in rates, deductibles, etc. And this is not going to help the situation. I wish I had better news.
No, David, that was going to be my follow-up question, is around the fact that so many people are right now claiming insurance for loss of income. I mean, the insurance sector, we haven't even begun to imagine the kind of claims that they're going to have. And if we thought it was bad prior for condominiums, I can only imagine getting out of this pandemic, what the insurance industry is going to face and what landlords are going to face in terms of those additional costs. So interesting point.
Yeah. That's a great question. Thanks again for raising it.
Well, and as a strata council owner, as opposed to a big landlord like Daniel, I've also been strata council president, and seeing the insurance rates go up both on our building as a whole and also personal. I can't imagine, as you say, I can't imagine any good part coming out of this crisis that would actually alleviate insurance costs. So I think it's going to be another issue which we'll tackle. But I guess it kind of draws my attention, being on the social democratic side of the fence, to the importance of government right now as we see the pandemic going on, and obviously groups like yours and the members you represent, renters, major businesses that are facing crisis. Massive unemployment. We saw 1 million Canadians apply for EI. How do you see the role of government going forward? Because obviously there's some tension there between your members and government at different times, and you mentioned the rent control issue, but it looks like all of us are going to be a lot more dependent on government than perhaps we'd like, and certainly for the foreseeable future.
Well, I should say, we actually have a very positive relationship with the British Columbia government, and work very closely with them and have helped them make some real positive changes that have impacted renters, and really we're good for the broader sector. It's not necessarily the case that every landlord agrees with what I just said, but that's I think overall we were in a pretty good spot, and until this all happened. I think I've been thinking about this a lot, actually, and we are where we are in terms of what the federal government has done and the provincial government has done, or provincial governments for that matter, and so it's easy to be I guess hindsight is 2020. It probably would have been really nice. The feds have three things to worry about during a pandemic. Obviously, the health issues, the medical part of it, but the other two issues they really only need to care about, when you think about it, is that their citizens have food and shelter. And in some respects, it would have been great, I suppose, if the provinces and the feds quickly talked, or there was a pandemic strategy where really, if you're looking at what's happening here, the issue is there's no cash in the hands of people who need it. And so I wish the feds had gone to CRA, look at everybody who filed a tax return, figure out some threshold, and just started sending cash. And that would have, I think, been really helpful. It would have negated the need for this moratorium on evictions. I mean, I think the system would have continued running, and that everybody would have understood their responsibilities, but they would have had the money to do that. And that's where the anxiety is, and it's been, as a consequence, it's renters are hugely stressed. Landlords. I mean, I just wish it had unfolded differently. But like I said, hindsight is 20/20. I think important lesson to learn. I'm sure that I'm no economist or people way smarter than me that will do a post-mortem on this, and hopefully we'll be better prepared next time. But that I think is the bottom line issue here, is that we've created a situation where the cash isn't in the hand. The programs, they're actually pretty robust, but they're confusing. The application processes aren't enforced. Service Canada workers are not in the office, so there's all these complexities. And then so everybody's understandably really anxious. So we need to get cash in hand for these folks, and then because of the eviction moratorium, and again, I get it. Everybody, government was under huge pressure, and this is a crisis. But they need stronger messaging around everyone's responsibility to do their part, and that means that renters who have the capacity to pay, or they need to pay their rent. It's this otherwise this is all going to come crashing down, and no one is going to be a winner here.
David Hudniak, on that note, thank you very much for showing up and participating in our dialogue today. David is the CEO of Landlord BC, a very good spokesperson, really laid out some of the key issues that are facing the sector. And I really want to thank you for taking out the time. I know it's a very stressful time for your members and for so many people throughout the community. So thanks for coming on and helping to explain a little bit more of some of the challenges that your members are facing.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. And really, I want to reiterate, we truly are in this together. And our goal here is to be a productive, solution-driven organization with government, because that relationship is really important. We need to work together, but we also continue to impress upon our sector. Landlords need to work with their tenants, try to find solutions. And renters, equally, they have a responsibility here to come to the table, and everybody needs to do their part. And we'll get through this. It's going to be interesting to see where we end up. It's going to be very different than it was before this happens. But I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you very much.
Thanks, David.
Okay. Thanks so much for coming on, and we'll be right back.
BC Polytalk thanks Harbour Air for supporting the show. It's through sponsorship and viewer support that we get to produce this show.
Daniel, that was really interesting. We haven't talked to anybody from the landlord side in this business as we go through the COVID-19 crisis. And pretty clearly, David Hudniak from Landlord BC has a lot on his plate and a lot of worries to have with all of the, as he put it, mom and pop owners who have one suite, perhaps a basement suite or a cottage suite in the backyard, who have renters who just can't make the rent.
No, and I think that was probably, I could only imagine in the back rooms of government, that was something that was on their minds around the moratorium on evictions. Because if you impose a moratorium on evictions, it's not just the big landlords with these big towers full of apartments, etc. It's actually a lot of people who have someone in their basement and who's paying rent, and that's helping to pay their mortgage. So I can only imagine that the provincial government must have really struggled with this one, and they were trying to come up the middle with a bit of a compromise by putting in the $500 subsidy. But, we'll see how this all plays out. There are going to be people who some will take advantage of it in a negative way, and others will take advantage of the program because it'll help actually make ends meet. But I can only imagine, based on what he said, that there are a lot of people behind the scenes who are extremely stressed at the prospect of 10 to 12% unemployment, businesses. I heard Bill yesterday, I think it was the head of the Restaurant Canada, Mark Van Schelwitz, indicate that something like 10 to 15% of all the restaurants are not simply going to open up again. They just simply will not be able to do that. And that's a lot of people out of work for a lot longer than the pandemic.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think probably for me, the biggest takeaway, Daniel, was when David said that not only do they want to see this program extended, but they want to make the amount of money being paid to renters or loaned to renters by the government quite a bit higher, because we know $500 won't rent you a studio in Vancouver or maybe even in Westminster where you are. It's kind of like it's certainly helpful, I'm sure, that renters appreciate that and landlords appreciate that, but it isn't coming near covering the cost of a two-person family with a mom and dad and two kids, or whatever the social configuration is. A four-person family isn't paying $500.
Yeah, and he also hinted, he dropped a little bit of a hint in the discussion there, I'm sure, again, around the discussion they've been having with the province around whether or not it's for a single individual within the home, or if you have a young couple, are both eligible for the $500. I think that's still at play at the moment. But yeah, it's an incredibly stressful time for him. And then as you heard me ask him around the insurance rates as well, I mean, layer on the stress of the insurance premiums and then the COVID and everything else. He kept emphasizing in the interview, we're all in this together. And I think he's right. I think that if the ecosystem, the rental ecosystem collapses, it's going to hurt both renters and tenants. And it really is incumbent upon the government to work with the landlords to make sure that the system stays intact. So post COVID-19, we're not left with a mess that we're going to have to fix for the next decade.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And of course, I think renters are generally, as he said, responsible and understand their landlord's position and that. But if we had mass evictions and mass defaults of renters, it would have an economic effect that would be devastating, even beyond what we already have now. So it was an interesting conversation, and we're glad that David was able to join us remotely, as we do all our BC Polytalk shows remotely now, and we keep trying to improve the technology. So we're working on that, and we want to thank all of our listeners and all of our viewers for joining us once again on BC Polytalk. We'll see you next week.
See you next week.
And remember, you can find everything at our website, bcpolytalk.ca. You can also chase us down on Spotify and iTunes for podcasts. You can find us on Vimeo. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook and find links there. You can go to YouTube and see the show.